It was a cold night in Los Angeles, sometime in the late 1970s, and near the back of a small comedy club sat a young man almost no one in the room had learned to recognize yet. His name was Robin Williams. He wasn't famous. He hadn't carried a television special. He was just another hungry face in the crowd, sitting a little apart from the others, hands folded on the table, watching the stage with an intensity that made the people beside him glance over more than once. On that stage, under a single warm light, stood George Carlin. Carlin was already a legend by then, the man who had taken ordinary language and turned it into both a weapon and a mirror. The comedian who made audiences laugh at the exact moment they realized he was telling the truth. And Robin Williams had not come to be seen that night. He had come to study. He had driven across the city for this, past the bright signs and the traffic, to sit in a dark room and watch one man work. He had chosen a table where no one would notice him, ordered nothing, and settled in like a student before an exam he had spent years preparing for. What happened in that room, and in the few short minutes that followed backstage, would stay with Robin Williams for the rest of his life. But when the lights finally came up and the crowd began to move toward the doors, the young man in the back could not speak. Not one word. George Carlin, by that night, had already lived several lives. He had started as a clean-cut young man in a suit and tie, telling safe jokes on daytime television, smiling the way the networks wanted him to smile. For years, he had been the comedian your parents could approve of. And then, quietly and deliberately, he had torn that man apart. He grew his hair long. He grew a beard. He traded the suit for denim and black, and he walked away from the money and the safety, because he had decided he could no longer stand on a stage and pretend to be someone the audience wanted instead of someone he actually was. It had cost him. There were bookings he lost, doors that closed, nights when the crowd did not understand the man who had replaced the one they came to see. But by the late 1970s, that reinvention had made him one of the most respected voices in American comedy. He was sharp now, older, more precise. Every pause was placed, every word was chosen. He no longer chased the laugh, he waited for it, and it came to him. On stage that night, he was completely in command. A man who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to an artist, which is to lose himself, and had somehow found his way back. There was a stillness to him now that the younger comics did not have and could not fake. He did not pace. He did not sweat for the laugh. He stood almost motionless in the center of that light, as if he had nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide. And that stillness was its own kind of authority. And in the back of the room, a young man was watching all of it, learning something he did not yet have the words for. To understand that silence, you have to understand the city and the year. Los Angeles in the late 1970s was a strange and electric place for comedy. The old nightclub circuit was fading, and something rawer was rising in its place. Small rooms with brick walls and cheap drinks, where comedians tested material that would never have survived on network television. These clubs stayed open late. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and ambition. Along a single stretch of boulevard, you could find a dozen young comics waiting in line for a 5-minute spot, each one convinced that this was the night everything would change. It was a brotherhood built on nerves. They watched each other from the shadows. They stole nothing but courage. And they measured themselves against the few men who had already made it to the top. And no one stood higher in that particular world than George Carlin. He had already released the albums that changed everything. He had already stood before a courtroom and a country and refused to apologize for the way ordinary people actually spoke. To the young comedians in those rooms, Carlin was not just successful. He was proof that a person could be completely honest on a stage and survive it. They studied his albums the way musicians study a difficult score, playing them again and again, trying to understand how a man could make an audience laugh and think at the same instant, how he could say the forbidden thing and make it feel not like an attack, but like a confession the whole room had been waiting to hear. So when word spread that Carlin was working a small room that night, the young ones came, and one of them came earlier and stayed longer than all the rest. The set that night was not Carlin's loudest or his most famous. It was something quieter and, in a way, more dangerous. He was working through material about ordinary life, the small absurdities of how people talk to each other, the words they use to avoid the things they really mean. He would say a single plain sentence, and then he would stop, and in that stop, the whole room would lean forward, because everyone could feel that the next few words were going to land somewhere true. The laughter did not explode. It rolled. It came in waves that started as recognition and only then became laughter. The sound of a room full of strangers realizing at the same moment that this man had noticed something about their lives that they had never quite admitted to themselves. Robin Williams was not laughing the way the others laughed. He was watching the craft of it. He was watching how Carlin controlled the silence, how he trusted it, how he was not afraid of the empty second before a laugh, the way younger comics always were. For a performer who filled every gap with sound, it must have looked almost impossible, this willingness to simply wait. And somewhere in the middle of that set, something in the younger man began to ache. A mixture of admiration and longing, and a quiet, uncomfortable question. It was a strange thing to feel in the middle of a comedy show, this quiet grief rising underneath the laughter. But Robin Williams felt it, and he did not look away. He watched the way the older man let a joke breathe, the way he stood inside a silence that would have terrified anyone else. And he understood that he was seeing something rare, a performer who had made peace with being alone up there. Could he ever be that honest? Could he ever stand that still and let a room see him with nowhere left to hide? The young man in the back was not ordinary either, though almost no one knew it yet. Robin Williams was somewhere in his 20s, a whirlwind of energy that the small clubs could barely contain. When he took a stage himself, he did not so much perform as erupt, leaping between voices and characters so fast that audiences could hardly keep up, laughing before they understood why. He was electric, unpredictable, generous, and underneath all of that motion, there was something the crowds rarely saw. Robin Williams was, even then, a deeply sensitive man. A man who felt everything twice as hard as the people around him, who could fill a room with joy and then sit alone afterward, feeling strangely empty. That was part of why he came to watch Carlin. Where Robin was a storm, Carlin was a blade. Where Robin gave the audience everything at once, Carlin gave them one perfect thing at a time and made them wait for it. The younger man understood, somewhere deep down, that his own gift was also a kind of hiding, that all that speed and noise could be a way of never standing still long enough to be truly seen. And here, on this small stage, was a man who stood perfectly still, who was not hiding at all, who had walked straight into the danger of being completely himself. Robin Williams watched George Carlin the way a young man watches the person he is afraid and hoping he might one day become. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. The young man tried to speak and could not. All the words he had rehearsed on the drive over, all the questions, all the admiration, had collapsed into a single, overwhelming feeling that had no shape. He managed, finally, only a few broken sentences, that he thought Carlin was the best there had ever been, that he did not know how anyone could be that honest, that he was afraid he himself never could. And George Carlin, who had every reason to be tired, who had heard 1,000 young comics say 1,000 nervous things, did not brush him off. He looked at the young man for a long moment, and then he said something quiet, something that Robin Williams would repeat in different words for the rest of his career. He told him not to be afraid of the silence. He told him that the courage was not in the noise. It was in the pause, in the willingness to stand still and let people see you. He told him that the audience did not fall in love with how fast you were. They fell in love with the truth you were brave enough to stop and tell. And then, almost as an afterthought, Carlin told him the thing that mattered most, that the gift the young man clearly had was real and rare, and that the only thing that could ever ruin it was hiding behind it. Be yourself up there, he said, even when it terrifies you, especially then. When the set ended, the applause was warm but not wild, the kind of applause a room gives when it has been made to think as much as laugh. Carlin gave a small nod, the nod of a man who knew exactly what he had done, and walked off toward the narrow hallway behind the stage. Most of the crowd began to gather their coats, but the young man in the back did not move for a long moment. And then, almost without deciding to, Robin Williams stood up and made his way toward the back of the club, toward the door that led backstage. This was the choice. Every young comedian knows this moment, the few seconds when you decide whether to approach the person you admire or let them disappear forever into the night. Most let them go. It is easier. It costs nothing to stay in your seat, and it protects you from the one thing every young performer fears most, which is to be dismissed by the person you admire. There is a kind of safety in worship from a distance. As long as you never speak to your heroes, they can never disappoint you, and you can never embarrass yourself. But Robin Williams walked to that door, and he stepped through it. And there, in a cramped hallway lit by a single bare bulb, he found himself standing a few feet away from George Carlin. And this was the part he would talk about for the rest of his life. Because when the older man turned and looked at him and waited and gave him the room to say whatever he had come to say, Robin Williams, the fastest voice in American comedy, the man who could become 100 characters in a single minute, opened his mouth and found that nothing came out. Robin Williams walked out of that club into the cold Los Angeles night, a different man than the one who had walked in. He would go on, of course, to become one of the most beloved performers the world has ever known. A man whose face and voice and impossible energy would fill theaters and living rooms across the globe. But he never forgot that hallway. For the rest of his life, whenever he spoke about the comedians who had shaped him, one name came first, spoken with a reverence that surprised people who only knew Robin Williams as the funniest man in any room. He called George Carlin his idol. He said Carlin was the reason he understood that comedy could be more than jokes, that it could be honesty, that it could be a kind of courage. And when Carlin died in 2008, Robin Williams grieved him the way you grieve a father. The two of them are both gone now. Two men who spent their lives making millions of strangers laugh, and who carried offstage a sensitivity that the laughter never quite reached. But there was a night in a small room in Los Angeles when one of them was still unknown and afraid, and the other stopped long enough to tell him the truth. Be yourself up there, even when it terrifies you. Robin Williams could not speak that night, but he spent the rest of his life saying, in his own way, exactly what George Carlin had told him. And that is why the room never really went quiet at all.